So what we're talking about here when we're talking about, there's my note to refer to the new dairy herd meth. I talked about there's a draft methodology that's been done for dairy herd emissions. So this is real, this is happening. What you're talking about is the emissions per kilogram live sold, like turned off, is what you're looking at. So your herd is going to emit, but what you've got to look at is you're producing protein with it, and we still want protein. So you get that variation within a herd. Some animals emit more than others, but you'll end up with a baseline. Now that baseline might be regionally set. It might be northern beef herd, southern beef herd. It might be like a management system. It might be more intensive stuff versus less. Or it could be your property. What you want to do then is start a project that does something that then reduces what your average emissions per kilo turned off is. And you get to claim the difference, potentially, if a methodology gets up and you do everything right. So this is your creditable difference. Animal manipulation, you do it already. Basically, your animal husbandry techniques, you do them now. They're the things that you can change in the short term. So you're talking about breeding. What you're actually trying to do is reduce your emissions per kilo turned off. If you've got 100 cows and you've got a weaning rate of 50%, you're only going to get 50 calves that you can turn off. If you can bring your weaning rates up, you've got 100 cows for 100 calves turned off, your emissions per kilo turned off have just dropped. Because you had 50 cows there emitting methane and contributing nothing. Now, not only does it reduce your emissions per kilo, it increases your profitability. That's why I like these things. You can talk about, we all know that you see animals that just do better, they grow quicker. Yeah, it's the same with methane. So you actually start selecting for those animals and doing it more intensively. So everyone sort of does a bit of herd improvement type stuff, but actually really be sitting there and really hit it hard, and you'll see some fairly dramatic differences. Management systems, you know, you don't have the money, but you would always have loved to have put in a few more fences, some different watering points, and actually more intensively manage your herd. Maybe this is the tool to do it. Because if you have different management systems, you can actually make them grow quicker. And I don't know what, you know, you'll all be doing different things, but it surprises people to learn that in large parts of South Australia they don't preg test, so they don't even know what their weaning rates are. Some people are just having full mixed herds, whereas if you go to managed grazing, where the calves are only eating with the calves and that sort of stuff, you reduce competition, so they actually do better. And that's well-known type stuff that you can do. And this isn't, get rid of unproductive animals. This isn't all smoke and mirrors type stuff. It's happening now. But what they've done is with a property up at Georgetown. They've actually gone through. They started in 1996. Over 15 years, they started with 25 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilo turned off. Now they're talking about, they reckon only about maybe 15% of this property was being utilised as well. So it wasn't a particularly intensive thing. Over 15 years, they got it down to 11. Now, what they did is they spent money. Like, this stuff it's not for free, but it obviously pays off. And they didn't do it for carbon, obviously, like they started in 96. They did it for animal production purposes. They increased the breeding rate, reduced the age at first pregnancy, did all these things. They've put in a fair amount of money in terms of fencing and land management stuff. But they did the things that you'd want to do to make it a more efficient operation. But in the meantime, you get a 14 kilo difference per kilo turned off. The difference where you get to, because you've got to make it tonnes and all the rest of it, they're turning off 1,500 head at 300 kilos. One of the other really good things they did was, if they're on your property emitting for a shorter period of time, you get less emissions. So reduce the time it takes them to get there. So it works out to be about 4 tonne per head turned off that place is the difference. So if there was a methodology and you could make that work, then you could be looking at, theoretically, 4 carbon credit units per head turned off. So it actually starts to add up, or it worked out to be about 6,300 tonnes per year for the property.
Yeah, that'd be good.
So we've covered the reduced enteric fermentation in livestock. We've talked about livestock emissions and the reduction of methane. So that's emissions avoidance. Now we're going to talk about carbon sequestration. That's the plants, that's the soil. And we talked earlier about how there's different types, the same as avoidance, where you've got compliance or voluntary credits. So I'm just going to run through a bit of an example for what that might mean. So when we're talking about human-induced regeneration, when people are talking about sequestered carbon, what they're actually talking about is this. And there's a number of elements to it. You've got coarse woody debris, which is logs, and I can't remember, it's about like 10 centimetres around, I think it is, might be 15. You've got standing vegetation, which is pretty self-explanatory. Grass and forbs, all that lower stuff. You've got leaf litter, which is pretty much everything that's not a log. And then you've got soil. And there's a lot of talk about soil from time to time, and we need to actually, I'll cover that in a little bit. So when you talk about sequestered, we talked about how this requires permanence, and that was obviously an issue for a number of people here. So how might you do this? What might you do? So there is actually a methodology for sequestered carbon. It's called the human-induced regeneration of an even-aged forest. Now, I'm not saying it applies to your case, but if you were using a methodology like that, and this is a property in Queensland, you might look at different ways. So instead of locking up the entire property, maybe you start to look at a different way to manage it. And so you can tell this is this stuff here is being changed, you can see. So that's basically white on a PMAV. These blocks here, maybe these are blocks that are uneconomic. Like everyone knows that we've got country that doesn't make money for you. The cattle actually lose condition when they're in here. This one's actually a bit of a stony outcrop with some trees. And not only do they lose condition, they're hard to muster. So that country costs you money. And so maybe that's where you look at doing a sequestration project. You're not going to lose anything anyway. Now you've got to do something additional, and maybe additional is putting a fence around it, stopping the grazing, managing fire or feral animal pressure. You've got to do something to bring that country back, but it's not contributing to your enterprise now, so it's an additional value that you might actually be able to recognise as well. The difficulty, and we talked about it before, is where your baseline is going to be set. You can see here that this has got timber on it already. Is it already reached peak? If you're looking at in 15 years' time you're going to get to there, is this country already up there in terms of the carbon it's going to store? The baseline is going to determine how much you're actually going to be able to claim a credit from. So if your baseline is set, the human-induced regeneration methodology, for instance, if you could use that, and if that applies in your situation, it sets a baseline at 0. So you'd be fine. But if you're using a methodology that actually looks at what's there already, and your baseline is there, well, maybe you can't do anything. Or if it's setting the baseline at what is currently there now before you start, and this is fairly mature scrub, then you mightn't actually be able to generate anything. The only advantage you'd get were those management advantages, because your cattle lose condition and they're hard to muster in there. So you've really got to balance that off, and it's going to depend on the methodology and the baseline. This is similar sort of country, and so you could look at doing that there. As long as you can geographically identify these areas, they could potentially be a project. So we've started with talking about all the components that might make up the carbon market. And we've talked about all the things that you need to do that make up a carbon product, and the process that you would need to follow to turn your on-ground activity into an Australian carbon credit unit. But the question really now is for landholders, what are you going to do? And there's issues and opportunities in this. And to me, and it's just my opinion I suppose, but you really need to start to think, are there other activities that you undertake that could include a carbon benefit? Are you doing things now that actually fit really nicely into the carbon farming initiative, and you could actually transfer with without too much hassle? And they're obviously things that you're interested in doing because you're doing them now. But also, maybe more importantly, are there things that the carbon market will help you to do? Are there activities that you want to do that will give a carbon farming initiative benefit? Maybe you want to put in some different infrastructure, you want to put in different fences so that you can manage your herd differently, which will make it more efficient, but you just can't justify the cost at the moment. Will the carbon market help you justify that cost? Maybe you want to look at that block of country we were talking about. You've always wanted to do it, but really, paying for the fencing, keeping the stock out of there, maybe the carbon market will actually make that possible. So I'd be driving around the place looking at those sorts of opportunities and just start your thinking that way, because that's going to be the lower risk way for you to get into it in terms of your land management activities. We're just about finished, and this one's a little bit of a bugbear of mine. Decide to do something or decide to do nothing. Just make a decision. A lot of the time when new stuff comes up, we just let it wash over us and we don't actually decide about it. We just sort of ignore it and hope it goes away. So we miss the opportunity that might be there. And it's fine to decide to do nothing. At this stage, it's really early in the market. A lot of people will probably decide to do nothing, but don't just ignore it. Because at least if you decide to do nothing, whether it's because of policy risk or you're not sure what the market's going to do, or there's no methodologies, if it's stuff like that, if something changes, then you can reassess and maybe you're open to the opportunities then. If you just let it wash over you and you just ignore it, things will change and you won't see the opportunity go past. So decide. If you decide to do something, people might start with this first one, where you look at the landscape. When you're out there, you're travelling around, you're looking at stock, you're looking at water points and stuff. Actually look at your landscape, look at your operation to try and understand the opportunities that you could get out of the CFI. What are you doing that might do carbon? Is there NRM benefits to be gained? Is there productivity benefits to be gained? If you're happy with that, then maybe you'd push for involvement in demonstration projects. And I talked about that action on the ground fund. If there's a methodology there and you want to develop a project, that's a really good way to get into it. Or even someone else in the district might have one of those. Well, go and have a look, talk to them, find out what it's like. They're supposed to be there to help demonstrate what the actions will look like. The biodiversity fund's another good one. That's just short of $1 billion for good land management projects. Now, it excludes this part of Queensland this time around, but who knows what it's going to fund next time around. So just keep an eye out. And those sorts of things are advertised. You can go to Hayley at DCQ, she'll know when they're coming up. The Australian government advertises them. You can just keep an eye on their website. But if you see something you're interested in, if you see you hear something on the radio and you hear about a researcher doing something under the filling the research gap and you want to know what's going on, ring them up. Say you want the information, chase it down. You can get that information that way. The really keen people will get in, they'll develop projects, probably with commercial operators, but you've got to make sure it suits your personal situation. And I know that says financial, but there's a whole heap of other deciders. We were talking about whether the boys were going to come home and whether they like merinos or not. You might be ready to retire and so you just don't want to do it. They're all fine things. You've got to make sure if you're going to get into these obligations that they actually suit your situation. But as a minimum, stay informed. At least now, hopefully when you're reading the newspapers, you're listening to the radio, you can differentiate between all the stuff about a carbon tax or climate change and what the CFI is. And the stuff that they talk about for a CFI actually starts to make sense. When people are talking about soil carbon, or they're talking about permanence, or they're talking about sequestration, you actually know what they're talking about now. Now, there are risks, as there are with most opportunities. There's market and policy risks. It's a new market. There's market risk in what you do with cattle, but you know it. You've been doing it for years, and it's still, you still get burnt from time to time, but there's going to be market risk in this, and there's policy risk in this. There's still uncertainty. There's contract risk. There's going to be a lot of contracts involved. Make sure you get independent legal advice. You want to make sure that you don't get tied into something you don't want to be involved in. You want to make sure that there's contracts that actually share the upside and the risk. It's got to be worthwhile for you. There's a lack of qualified operators at the moment, and that's not having a go at anyone, but it's a new thing. So there's not that many people out there to help you out. Now, the Australian government, part of that big program we looked at earlier, they've got funding to help do that, to support operators come out and provide advice. They're also looking at establishing like a qualification so that you know someone's certified as being, you know, fair income about the CFI, they know their stuff. And so that'll be coming out over time. There's permanence obligations, and we've talked about them quite a bit, and we've talked about what it might mean, but if you look at that diversified property map that we had, well, maybe that's the sort of approach you want to take. Be cautious, there's a risk of bad land management outcomes. Now, the negative list is designed to try and stop that at the regional level, but you've still got to be really sure that on your property, you're actually getting the land management outcomes that you want. You don't want to get into a project that's actually giving you land management outcomes that are different to where you want to head into the future. And then there's reporting and verification risks. It could cost more than the credit's worth. You could do the project and then not actually be able to demonstrate an increase in carbon stored or reduced emissions. You could, you know, get the paperwork wrong and you're not going to find out until the end of the year or something. You want to be really careful there about some of those risks. That's about it.